Chapter 12, Part 2 of The Guns of Shiloh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 12, Grant's Great Victory, Part 2. The sergeant beat steadily and insistently. Yet he was forced to continue it 5 or 6 minutes before it was thrown open. Then a tall old woman, with a dignified, stern face and white hair drawn back from high brows, stood before them. But Dick's quick eyes saw in the dusk of the room behind her a girl of 17 or 18. "What do you want?" asked the woman in a tone of ice. "I see that you're Yankee soldiers, and if you intend to rob the house, there's no one here to oppose you. Its sole occupants are myself, my granddaughter, and 2 colored women, our servants. But I tell you, before you begin, that all our silver has been shipped to Nashville." Colonel Winchester flushed a deep crimson and bit his lip savagely. "Madam," he said, "we are not robbers and plunderers. These are regular soldiers belonging to General Grant's army." "Does it make any difference? Your army's come to ravage and destroy the South." Colonel Winchester flushed again, but remembering his self-control, he said politely, "Madam, I hope our actions will prove to you that we've been maligned. We've not come here to rob you or disturb you in any manner. We merely wished to inquire of you if you had seen any other Southern armed forces in this vicinity." "And do you think, sir," she replied in the same uncompromising tones, "if I had seen them, that I would tell you anything about it?" "No, madam," replied the colonel, bowing. "Whatever I may have thought before I entered your portico, I do not think so now." "Then it gives me great pleasure to bid you good evening, sir," she said, and shut the door in his face. Colonel Winchester laughed rather sorely. "She had rather the better of me," he said, "but we can't make war on women. Come on, lads, we'll ride ahead and camp under the trees. It's easy to obtain plenty of fuel for fires." "The darkness is coming fast," said Dick, "and it's going to be very cold, as usual." In a half hour the day was fully gone, and, as he had foretold, the night was sharp with chill, setting every man to shivering. They turned aside into an oak grove and pitched their camp. It was never hard to obtain fuel, as the whole area of the great Civil War was largely in forest, and the soldiers dragged up fallen brushwood in abundance. Then the fires sprang up and created a wide circle of light and cheerfulness. Dick joined zealously in the task of finding firewood, and his search took him somewhat further than the others. He passed all the way through the belt of the forest and noticed fields beyond. He was about to turn back when he heard a faint but regular sound. Experience told him that it was the beat of horses' hoofs, and he knew that some distance away a road must lead between the fields. He walked 100 yards further, and climbing upon a fence, waited. From his perch he could see the road about 200 yards beyond him, and the hoofbeats were rapidly growing louder. Someone was riding hard and fast. In a minute the horseman, or rather horsewoman, came into view. There was enough light for Dick to see the slender figure of a young girl mounted on a great bay horse. She was wrapped in a heavy cloak, but her head was bare, and her long dark hair streamed almost straight out behind her, so great was the speed at which she rode. She struck the horse occasionally with a small riding whip, but he was already going like a racer. Dick remembered the slim figure of the girl, and it occurred to him suddenly that this was she whom he had seen in the dusk of the room behind her grandmother. He wondered why she was riding so fast, alone and in the winter night, and then he admitted with a thrill of admiration that he had never seen anyone ride better. The hoofbeats rose, died away, and then horse and girl were gone in the darkness. Dick climbed down from the fence and shook himself. Was it real or merely fancy, the product of a brain excited by so much siege and battle? He picked up a big dead bough in the wood, dragged it back to the camp, and threw it on one of the fires. "What are you looking so grave about, Dick?" asked Warner. "When I went across that stretch of woods I saw something that I didn't expect to see." "What was it?" A girl on a big horse. They came and they went so fast that I just got a glimpse of them." "A girl alone, galloping on a horse, on a wintry night like this, through a region infested by hostile armies? Why, Dick, you're seeing shadows. Better sit down and have a cup of this good hot coffee." But Dick shook his head. He knew now that he had seen reality, and he reported it to Colonel Winchester. "Are you sure it was the girl you saw at the big house?" asked Colonel Winchester. "It might have been some farmer's wife galloping home from an errand late in the evening." "It was the girl, I'm sure of it," said Dick confidently. Just at that moment Sergeant Whitley came up and saluted. "What is it, Sergeant?" asked the colonel. "I've been up the road some distance, sir, and I came to another road that crossed it. The second road has been cut by hoofs of 800 or 900 horses, and I am sure, sir, that the tracks are not a day old." Colonel Winchester looked grave. He knew that he was deep in the country of the enemy, and he began to put together what Dick had seen and what the sergeant had seen. But the thought of withdrawing did not occur to his brave soul. He had been sent on an errand by General Grant, and he meant to do it. But he changed his plans for the night. He had intended to keep only 1 man in 10 on watch. Instead, he kept half, and Sergeant Whitley, veteran of Indian wars, murmured words of approval under his breath. Whitley and Pennington were in the early watch. Dick and Warner were to come on later. The colonel spoke as if he would keep watch all night. All the horses were tethered carefully inside the ring of pickets. "It doesn't need any mathematical calculation," said Warner, "to tell that the colonel expects trouble of some kind tonight. What its nature is I don't know, but I mean to go to sleep nevertheless. I've already seen so much of hardship and war that the mere thought of danger doesn't trouble me. I took a fort on the Tennessee. I took a much larger one on the Cumberland, first defeating the enemy's army in a big battle, and now I'm preparing to march on Nashville. Hence I will not have my slumbers disturbed by a mere belief that danger may come." "It's a good resolution, George," said Dick, "but unlike you, I'm subject to impulses, emotions, thrills and anxieties." "Better cure yourself," said the Vermonter, as he rolled himself in the blankets and put his head on his arm. In 2 minutes he was asleep, but Dick, despite his weariness, had disturbed nerves which refused to let him sleep for a long time. He closed his eyes repeatedly and then opened them again, merely to see the tethered horses and beyond them the circle of sentinels, a clear moonlight falling on their rifle barrels. But it was very warm and cozy in the blankets, and he would soon fall asleep again. He was awakened about an hour after midnight to take his turn at the watch, and he noticed that Colonel Winchester was still standing beside one of the fires, but looking very anxious. Dick felt himself on good enough terms, despite his youth, to urge him to take rest. "I should like to do so," replied Colonel Winchester, "but Dick, I tell you, although you must keep it to yourself, that I think we're in some danger. Your glimpse of the flying horsewoman, and the undoubted fact that hundreds of horsemen have crossed the road ahead of us, have made me put 2 and 2 together." "Ah, what is it, Sergeant?" "I think I hear noises to the east of us, sir," replied the veteran. "What kind of noises, Sergeant?" "I should say, sir, they're made by the hoofs of horses. There, I hear them again, sir. I'm quite sure of it, and they're growing louder." "And so do I," exclaimed Colonel Winchester, now all life and activity. "The sounds are made by a large body of men advancing upon us. Seize that bugle, Dick, and blow the alarm with all your might." Dick snatched up the bugle and blew upon it a long, shrill blast that pierced far into the forest. He blew and blew again, and every man in the little force sprang to his feet in alarm. Nor were they a moment too soon. From the woods to the east came the answering notes of a bugle, and then a great voice cried, "Forward, men, and wipe 'em off the face of the earth!" It seemed to Dick that he had heard that voice before, but he had no time to think about it, as the next instant came the rush of wild horsemen, 1,000 strong, leaning low over their saddles, their faces dark with the passion of anger and revenge, pistols, rifles and carbines flashing as they pulled the trigger, giving way when empty to sabers which gleamed in the moonlight as they were swung by powerful hands. Colonel Winchester's whole force would have been ridden down in the twinkling of an eye had it not been for the minute's warning. His men, leaping to their feet, snatched up their own rifles and fired a volley at short range. It did more execution among the horses than among the horsemen, and the Southern rough riders were compelled to waver for a moment. Many of their horses went down, others uttered the terrible shrieking neigh of the wounded, and despite the efforts of those who rode them, strove to turn and flee from those flaming muzzles. It was only a moment, but it gave the Union troop, save those who were already slain, time to spring upon their horses and draw back at the colonel's shouted command to the cover of the wood. But they were driven hard. The Confederate cavalry came on again, impetuous and fierce as ever, and urged continually by their great partisan leader, Forrest, now in the very dawn of his fame. "It was no phantom you saw, that girl on the horse," shouted Warner in Dick's ear, and Dick nodded in return. They had no time for other words, as Forrest's horsemen, far outnumbering them, now pressed them harder than ever. A continuous fire came from their ranks, and at close range they rode in with the saber. Dick experienced the full terror and surprise of a night battle. The opposing forces were so close together that it was often difficult to tell friend from enemy. But Forrest's men had every advantage of surprise, superior numbers, and perfect knowledge of the country. Dick groaned aloud as he saw that the best they could do was to save as many as possible. Why had he not taken a shot at the horse of that flying girl? "We must keep together, Dick," shouted Warner. "Here are Pennington and Sergeant Whitley, and there's Colonel Winchester. I fancy that if we can get off with a part of our men we'll be doing well." Pennington's horse, shot through the head, dropped like a stone to the ground, but the deft youth, used to riding the wild mustangs of the prairie, leaped clear, seized another which was galloping about riderless, and at one bound sprang into the saddle. "Good boy!" shouted Dick with admiration, but the next moment the horsemen of Forrest were rushing upon them anew. More men were killed, many were taken, and Colonel Winchester, seeing the futility of further resistance, gathered together those who were left and took flight through the forest. Tears of mortification came to Dick's eyes, but Sergeant Whitley, who rode on his right hand, said, "It's the only thing to do. Remember that however bad your position may be, it can always be worse. It's better for some of us to escape than for all of us to be down or be taken." Dick knew that his logic was good, but the mortification nevertheless remained a long time. There was some consolation, however, in the fact that his own particular friends had neither fallen nor been taken. They still heard the shouts of pursuing horsemen, and shots rattled about them, but now the covering darkness was their friend, and they drew slowly away from all pursuit. The shouts and the sounds of trampling hoofs died behind them, and after 2 hours of hard riding, Colonel Winchester drew rein and ordered a halt. It was a disordered and downcast company of about 50 who were left. A few of these were wounded, but not badly enough to be disabled. Colonel Winchester's own head had been grazed, but he had bound a handkerchief about it and sat very quiet in his saddle. "My lads," he said, and his tone was sharp with a note of defiance, "we've been surprised by a force greatly superior to our own, and scarcely a sixth of us are left. But it was my fault. I take the blame. For the present, at least, we are safe from the enemy, and I intend to continue with our errand. We were to scout the country all the way to Nashville. It is also possible that we will meet the division of General Buell advancing to that city. Now, lads, I hope that you all will be willing to go on with me." "Are you?" "We are," roared 50 together, and a smile passed over the wan face of the colonel, but he said no more then. Instead, he turned his head toward the capital city of the state and rode until dawn, his men following close behind him. The boys were weary. In truth, all of them were, but no one spoke of halting or complained in any manner. At sunrise they stopped in dense forest at the banks of a creek and watered their horses. They cooked what food they had left, and after eating, rested for several hours on the ground, most of them going to sleep, while a few men kept a vigilant watch. When Dick awoke, it was nearly noon, and he still felt sore from his exertions. An hour later they all mounted and rode again toward Nashville. Near night they boldly entered a small village and bought food. The inhabitants were all strongly Southern, but villagers love to talk, and they learned there in a manner admitting of no doubt that the Confederate army was retreating southward from the line of the Cumberland, that the state capital had been abandoned, and that to the eastward of them the Union army under Buell was advancing swiftly on Nashville. "At least we accomplished our mission," said Colonel Winchester with some return of cheerfulness. "We have discovered the retreat of General Johnston's whole army and the abandonment of Nashville, invaluable information to General Grant, but we'll press on toward Nashville nevertheless." They camped the next night in a forest and kept a most vigilant watch. If those terrible raiders led by Forrest should strike them again, they could make but little defense. They came the next morning upon a good road and followed it without interruption until nearly noon, and when they saw the glint of arms across a wide field, Colonel Winchester drew his little troop back into the edge of the woods and put his field glasses to his eyes. "There are many men riding along a road parallel to ours," he said. "They look like an entire regiment, and by all that's lucky they're in the uniforms of our own troops. Yes, they're our own men. There can be no mistake. It is probably the advance guard of Buell's army." They still had a trumpet, and at the colonel's order it was blown long and loud. An answering call came from the men on the parallel road, and they halted. Then Colonel Winchester's little troop galloped forward, and they were soon shaking hands with the men of a mounted regiment from Ohio. They had been sent ahead by Buell to watch Johnston's army, but hearing of the abandonment of Nashville, they were now riding straight for the city. Colonel Winchester and his troop joined them gladly, and the colonel rode by the side of the Ohio colonel, Mitchell. Dick and his young comrades felt great relief. He realized the terrible activity of Forrest, but that cavalry leader, even if he had not now gone south, would hesitate about attacking the powerful regiment with which Dick now rode. Warner and Pennington shared his feelings. "The chances are 90% in our favor," said the Vermonter, "that we'll ride into Nashville without a fight. I've never been in Tennessee before, and I'm a long way from home, but I'm curious to see this city. I'd like to sleep in a house once more." They rode into Nashville the next morning amid frowning looks, but the half-deserted city offered no resistance. End of chapter 12, Part 2. Chapter 13, Part 1 of The Guns of Shiloh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 13, In the Forest, Part 1. Dick spent a week or more in Nashville, and he saw the arrival of one of General Grant's divisions on the fleet under Commodore Foote. Once more he appreciated the immense value of the rivers and the fleet to the north. He and the two lads, who were now knitted to him by sympathy and hardships and dangers shared, enjoyed their stay in Nashville. It was pleasant to sleep once more in houses and to be sheltered from rain and frost and snow. It was pleasant, too, for these youths who were devoted to the Union, to think that their armies had made such progress in the West. The silent and inflexible Grant had struck the first great blow for the North. The immense Confederate line in the West was driven far southward, and the capital of one of the most vigorous of the secessionist states was now held by the Union. But a little later, news not so pleasant came to them. The energy and success of Grant had aroused jealousy. Halleck, his superior, the general of books and maps at St. Louis, said that he had transcended the limits of his command. He was infringing upon territory of other Northern generals. Halleck had not found him to be the yielding subordinate who would win successes and let others have the credit. Grant was practically relieved of his command, and when Dick heard it, he felt a throb of rage. Boy as he was, he knew that what had been won must be held. Johnston had stopped at Murfreesboro, 30 or 40 miles away. His troops had recovered from their panic caused by the fall of Donelson, and fresh regiments and brigades were joining him. His army was rising to 40,000 men, and officers like Colonel Winchester began to feel apprehensive. Now came a period of waiting. The Northern leaders, as happened so often in this war, were uncertain of their authority and were at cross purposes. They seldom had the power of initiative that was permitted to the Southern generals, and of which they made such good use. Dick saw that the impression made by Donelson was fading. The North was reaping no harvest, and the South was lifting up its head again. While he was in Nashville he received a letter from his mother in reply to one of his that he had written to her just after Donelson. She was very thankful that her son had gone safely through the battle, and since he must fight in the war, which was terrible in any aspect, she was glad that he had borne himself bravely. She was also glad that Colonel Kenton had escaped capture. Her brother-in-law was always good to her and was a good man. She had also received a letter from his son, her nephew, written from Richmond. She loved Harry Kenton too, and sympathized with him, but she could not see how both sides could prevail. Dick read the letter over and over again, and there was a warm glow about his heart. What a brave woman his mother was. She said nothing about his coming back home or leaving the war. He wrote a long reply, and he told her only of the lighter and more cheerful events that they had encountered. He described Warner, Pennington, and the sergeant, and said that he had the best comrades in the world. He told, too, of his gallant and high-minded commander, Colonel Arthur Winchester. He was sure that the letter would reach her promptly, as it passed all the way through territory now controlled by the North. The next day after sending it, he heard with joy that Grant was restored to his command, and 2 days later Colonel Winchester and his men were ordered to join him at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. They heard also that Buell, with his whole division, was soon to march to the same place, and they saw in it an omen of speedy and concentrated action. "I imagine," said Warner, "that we'll soon go down in Mississippi hunting Johnston. We must outnumber the Johnny Rebs at least 2 to 1. I'm not a general, though anyone can see that I ought to be, and if we were to follow Johnston's army and crush it, the war would soon be ended in the West." "You've got a mighty big if," said Dick. "If we march into Mississippi we get pretty far from our base. We'll have to send a long distance through hostile country for fresh supplies and fresh troops, while the Southerners will be nearer to their own. Besides, it's not so certain that we can destroy Johnston when we find him." "Your talk sounds logical, and that being the case, I'll leave our future movements to General Grant. Anyway, it's a good thing not to have so much responsibility on your shoulders." They came in a few days to the great camp on the Tennessee. Spring was now breaking through the crust of winter. Touches of green were appearing on the forests and in the fields, and now and then the wonderful pungent odor of the wilderness came to them, and life seemed to have taken on new zest. They were but boys in years, and the terrible scenes of Donelson could not linger with them long. They found Colonel Newcomb and the little detachment of Pennsylvanians with Grant and Colonel Winchester, resuming command of his regiment, camped by their side, delighted to be with old friends again. Colonel Winchester had lost a portion of his regiment, but there were excuses. It had happened in a country well known to the enemy, but little known to him, and he had been attacked in overwhelming force by the rough-riding Forrest, who was long to be a terror to the Union divisions. But he had achieved the task on which he had been sent, and he was thanked by his commander. Dick, as he went on many errands or walked about in the course of his leisure hours with his friends, watched with interest the growth of a great army. There were more men here upon the banks of the Tennessee than he had seen at Bull Run. They were gathered full 40,000 strong, and General Buell's army also, he learned, had been put under command of General Grant and was advancing from Nashville to join him. Dick also observed with extreme interest the ground upon which they were encamped and the country surrounding it. There was the deep Tennessee, still swollen by spring rains, upon the left bank of which they lay, with a stream protecting one flank. In the river were some of the gunboats, which had been of such value to Grant. All about them was rough, hilly country, almost wholly covered with brushwood and tall forest. There were 3 deep creeks, given significant names by the pioneers. Lick Creek flowed to the south of them into the Tennessee, and Owl Creek to the north sought the same destination. A third, Snake Creek, was lined with deep and impassable swamps to its very junction with the river. Some roads of the usual frontier type ran through this region, and at a point within the northern line stood a little primitive log church that they called Shiloh. It was of the kind that the pioneers built everywhere as they moved from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Shiloh belonged to a little body of Methodists. Dick went into it more than once. There was no pastor and no congregation now, but the little church was not molested. He sat more than once on an uncompromising wooden bench and looked out through a window, from which the shutter was gone, at the forest and the army. Sitting here in this primitive house of worship, he would feel a certain sadness. It seemed strange that a great army, whose purpose was to destroy other armies, should be encamped around a building erected in the cause of the Prince of Peace. The mighty and terrible nature of the war was borne in upon him more fully than ever. But optimism was supreme among the soldiers. They had achieved the great victory of Donelson in the face of odds that had seemed impossible. They could defeat all the Southern forces that lay between them and the Gulf. The generals shared their confidence. They did not fortify their camp. They had not come that far south to fight defensive battles. It was their place to attack, and that of the men in gray to defend. They had advanced in triumph almost to the Mississippi line, and they would soon be pursuing their disorganized foe into that Gulf state. Several new generals came to serve under Grant. Among them was one named Sherman, to whom Dick bore messages several times, and who impressed him with his dry manner and curt remarks, which were yet so full of sense. It was Sherman's division, in fact, that was encamped around the little church, and Dick soon learned his opinions. He did not believe that they would so easily conquer the South. He did not look for any triumphal parade to the Gulf. In the beginning of the war he had brought great enmity and criticism upon himself by saying that 200,000 men at least would be needed at once to crush the Confederacy in the West alone. And yet it was to take more than 10 times that number, 4 bitter years, to achieve that task in both West and East. But optimism continued to reign in the Union army. Buell would arrive soon with his division, and then 70,000 strong they would resume their march southward, crushing everything. Meanwhile it was pleasant while they waited. They had an abundance of food. They were well sheltered from the rains, and the cold days were passing. Nature was bursting into its spring bloom, and the crisp, fresh winds that blew from the west and south were full of life and strength. It was a joy merely to breathe. One rainy day the 3 boys, who had met by chance, went into the little church for shelter from a sudden spring rain. From the shutterless window Dick saw Sergeant Whitley scurrying in search of a refuge, and they called to him. He came gladly and took a seat in one of the rough wooden pews of the little church of Shiloh. The 3 boys had the greatest respect for the character and judgment of the sergeant, and Dick asked him when he thought the army would march. "Well, they don't tell these things to sergeants," said Whitley. "But you see and you know a lot about war. Well, you've noticed that the army ain't getting ready to march. When General Buell gets here we'll have nigh unto 70,000 men, and 70,000 men can't lift themselves up by their bootstraps and leave all in a mornin'." "But we don't have to hurry," said Pennington. "There's no Southern army west of the Alleghanies that could stand before our 70,000 men for an hour." "General Buell ain't here yet." "But he's coming." "But he ain't here yet," persisted the sergeant, "and he can't be here for several days, 'cause the roads are mighty deep in the spring mud. Don't say any man is here until he's here. And I tell you that General Johnston with whom we've got to deal is a great man. I wasn't with him when he made that great march through the blizzards and across the plains to Salt Lake City to make the Mormons behave. But I've served with them, that was, and I've never yet found one of them who didn't say General Johnston was a mighty big man. Soldiers know when the right kind of man is holding the reins and driving 'em. Didn't we all feel that we was being driv right when General Grant took hold?" "We all felt it," said the three in chorus. "Of course you did," said the sergeant. "And now I've got a kind of uneasy feelin' over General Johnston. Why don't we hear something from him? Why don't we know what he's doing? We haven't sent out any scoutin' parties. On the plains, no matter how strong we was always on the lookout for hostile Indians, while here we know there's a big Confederate army somewhere within 50 miles of us, but don't take the trouble to look it up." "That's so," said Warner. "Caution represents less than 5% of our effectiveness. But I suppose we can whip the Johnnies anyway." "Of course we can," said Pennington, who was always of a most buoyant temperament. Sergeant Whitley went to the shutterless window and looked out at the forest and the long array of tents. "The rain is about over," he said. "It was just a passing shower, but it looks as if it had already added a fresh shade of green to the leaves and grass. Curious how quick a rain can do it in spring, when everything is just waiting a chance to grow and burst into bloom. I've rid on the plains when everything was brown and looked dead. 'Long come a big rain, and the next day everything was green as far as the eye could reach, and you'd see little flowers bloomin' down under the shelter of the grass." "I didn't know you had a poetical streak in you, Sergeant," said Dick, who marked his abrupt change from the discussion of the war to a far different topic. "I think some of it is in every man," replied Sergeant Whitley gravely. "I remember once when we had finished a long chase after some Northern Cheyennes through mighty rough and dry country, we come to a little valley, a kind of pocket in the hills, fed by a fine creek running out of the mountains on one side and into the mountains on the other. The pocket was maybe 2 miles long and maybe a mile across, and it was chock full of green trees and green grass and wild flowers. We enjoyed its comforts, but do you think that was all? Every man among us, and there was at least a dozen who couldn't read, admired its beauties and begun to talk softer and more gentle than they did when they was out on the dry plains. And you feel them things more in war than you do at any other time." "I suppose you do," said Dick. "The spring is coming out now in Kentucky where I live, and I'd like to see the new grass rippling before the wind and the young leaves on the trees rustling softly together." "Stop sentimentalizing," said Warner. "If you don't, it won't be a minute before Pennington will begin to talk about his Nebraska plains and how he'd like to see the buffalo herds, 10 million strong, rocking the earth as they go galloping by." Pennington smiled. "I won't see the buffalo herds," he said, "but look at the wild fowl going north." They left the window as the rain had ceased and went outside. All this region was still primitive and thinly settled, and now they saw flocks of wild ducks and wild geese winging northward. The next day the heavens themselves were darkened by the immense flight of wild pigeons. The country, cut up by so many rivers, creeks and brooks, swarmed with wild fowl, and more than once the soldiers roused up deer from the thickets. The second day after the talk of the four in the little church, Dick, who was now regarded as a most efficient and trusty young staff officer, was sent with a dispatch to General Buell, requesting him to press forward with as much speed as he could to the junction with General Grant. Several other aides were sent by different routes, in order to make sure that at least one would arrive. But Dick, through his former ride with Colonel Winchester to Nashville, had the most knowledge of the country, and hence was likely to reach Buell first. As the boy rode from the camp and crossed the river into the forest, he looked back, and he could not fail to notice to what an extent it was yet a citizen army and not one of trained soldiers. The veteran sergeant had already called his attention to what he deemed grave omissions. In the 3 weeks that they had been lying there they had thrown up no earthworks. Not a spade had touched the earth, nor was there any other defense of any kind. The high forest circled close about them, dense now with foliage and underbrush, hiding even at a distance of a few hundred yards anything that might lie within. The cavalry in these 3 weeks had made one scouting expedition, but it was slight and superficial, resulting in nothing. The generals of divisions posted their own pickets separately, leaving numerous wide breaks in the line, and the farmer lads, at the change of guard, invariably fired their rifles in the air to signify the joy of living, and because it was good to hear the sound. Now that he was riding away from them, these things impressed Dick more than when he was among them. Sergeant Whitley's warning and pessimistic words came back to him with new force, but as he rode into the depths of the forest he shook off all depression. Those words, 70,000 strong, continually recurred to him. Yes, they would be 70,000 strong when Buell came up, and the boys were right. Certainly there was no Confederate force in the West that could resist 70,000 troops, splendidly armed, flushed with victory, and led by a man like Grant. 70,000 strong. Dick's heart beat high at the unuttered words. Why should Grant fortify? It was for the enemy, not for him, to do such a thing. Nor was it possible that Johnston, even behind defenses, could resist the impact of the 70,000 who had been passing from one victory to another, and who were now in the very heart of the enemy's country. His heart continued to beat high and fast as he rode through the green forest. Its strong, sweet odors gave a fillip to his blood, and he pressed his horse to new speed. He rode without interruption night and day, save a few hours now and then for sleep, and reached the army of Buell, which, deep in mud, was toiling slowly forward. Buell was not as near to Shiloh as Dick had supposed, but his march had suffered great hindrances. Halleck, in an office far away in St. Louis, had undertaken to manage the campaign. His orders to Buell and his command to Grant had been delayed. Buell, who had moved to the town of Columbia, therefore had started late through no fault of his. Duck River, which Buell was compelled to cross, was swollen like all the other streams of the region by the great rains and was 40 feet deep. The railway bridge across it had been wrecked by the retreating Confederates, and he was compelled to wait there 2 weeks until his engineers could reconstruct it. End of chapter 13, Part 1. Chapter 13, Part 2 of The Guns of Shiloh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 13, In the Forest, Part 2. War plays singular chances. Halleck, in St. Louis, secure in his plan of campaign, had sent an order after Dick left Shiloh for Buell to turn to the north, leaving Grant to himself, and occupy a town that he named. Through some chance the order never reached Buell. Had it done so, the whole course of American history might have been changed. Grant himself, after the departure of the earlier messengers, changed his mind and sent messengers to Nelson, who led Buell's vanguard, telling him not to hurry. This army was to come to Pittsburgh Landing or Shiloh, partly by the Tennessee, and Grant stated that the vessels for him would not be ready until some days later. It was in the early stage of the war, when generals behaved with great independence, and Nelson, a rough, stubborn man, after reading the order, marched on faster than ever. It seemed afterward that the very stars were for Grant, when one order was lost and another disobeyed. But Dick was not to know of these things until later. He delivered in person his dispatch to General Buell, who remembered him and gave him a friendly nod, but who was as chary of speech as ever. He wrote a brief reply to the dispatch and gave it sealed to Dick. "This letter I hand you," he said, "merely notifies General Grant that I have received his orders and will hurry forward as much as possible. If on your return journey you should deem yourself in danger of falling into the hands of the enemy, destroy it at once." Dick promised to do so, saluted, and retired. He spent only 2 hours in General Buell's camp, securing some fresh provisions to carry in his saddlebags, and allowing his horse a little rest. Then he mounted and took as straight a course as he could for General Grant's camp at Pittsburgh Landing. The boy felt satisfied with himself. He had done his mission quickly and exactly, and he would have a pleasant ride back on his strong, swift horse, and with a good knowledge of the road he could go several times faster than Buell's army. He anticipated a pleasant ride. The forest seemed to him to be fairly drenched in spring. Little birds, flaming in color, darted among the boughs, and others, more modest in garb, poured forth a full volume of song. Dick, sensitive to sights and sounds, hummed a tune himself. It was the thundering song of the sea that he had heard Samuel Jarvis sing in the Kentucky mountains. They bore him away when the day had fled, and the storm was rolling high, and they laid him down on his lonely bed by the light of an angry sky. The lightning flashed, and the wild sea lashed the shore with its foaming wave, and the thunder passed on the rushing blast as it howled o'er the rover's grave. He pressed on hour after hour through the deep woods, meeting no one, but content. At noon his horse suddenly showed signs of great weariness, and Dick, remembering how much he had ridden him over muddy roads, gave him a long rest. Besides, there was no need to hurry. The Southern army was at Corinth in Mississippi, 3 or 4 days' journey away, and there had been no scouts or skirmishers in the woods between. After a stop of an hour he remounted and rode on again, but the horse was still feeling his great strain, and he did not push him beyond a walk. He calculated that nevertheless he would reach headquarters not long after nightfall, and he went along gaily, still singing to himself. He crossed the river at a point above the army, where the Union troops had made a ferry, and then turned toward the camp. About sunset he reached a hill from where he could look over the forest and see under the horizon faint lights that were made by Grant's campfires at Pittsburgh Landing. It was a welcome sight. He would soon be with his friends again, and he urged his horse forward a little faster. "Halt!" came a sharp voice from the thicket. Dick faced about in amazement. He saw 4 horsemen in gray riding from the bushes. The shock was as great as if he had been struck by a bullet. But he leaned forward on his horse's neck, kicked him violently with his heels, and shouted to him. The horse plunged forward at a gallop. The boy, remembering General Buell's instructions, slipped the letter from his pocket, and in the shelter of his horse's body dropped it to the ground, where he knew it would be lost among the bushes and in the twilight. "Halt!" was repeated more loudly and sharply than ever. Then a bullet whizzed by his ear, and a second pierced the heart of his good horse. He tried to leap clear of the falling animal, and succeeded, but he fell so hard among the bushes that he was stunned for a few moments. When he revived and stood up, he saw the 4 horsemen in gray looking curiously at him. "'Twould have been cheaper for you to have stopped when we told you to do so," said one in a whimsical tone. Dick noticed that the tone was not unkind. It was not the custom to treat prisoners ill in this great war. He rubbed his left shoulder, on which he had fallen, and which still pained him a little. "I didn't stop," he said, "because I didn't know that you'd be able to hit either me or my horse in the dusk. I suppose, from your way of looking at it, you were right to take the chance, but you've learned now that we Southern men are tolerable good sharpshooters." "I knew it long ago, but what are you doing here, right in the jaws of our army? They might close on you any minute with a snap. You ought to be with your own army at Corinth." Dick noticed that the men looked at one another, and there was silence for a moment or two. "Young feller," resumed the spokesman, "you was coming from the direction of Columbia, and your horse, which I'm sorry we had to kill, looked as if he was clean tuckered out. I judged that you was bearing a message from Buell's army to Grant's." "You mustn't hold me responsible for your judgment, good or bad." "No, I reckon not. But say, young feller, do you happen to have a chaw tobacco in your clothes?" "If I had any I'd offer it to you, but I never chew." The man sighed. "Well, maybe it's a bad habit," he said, "but it's powerful grippin'. I'd give a heap for a good twist of old Kentucky. Now we're goin' to search you, and it ain't worth while to resist, 'cause we got you where we want you, as the dog said to the coon when he took him by the throat. We're lookin' for letters and dispatches, 'cause we're sure you come from Buell. But if we should run across any tobacco, We'll have to help ourselves to it. We ain't no robbers, 'cause in times like these it ain't no robbery to take tobacco." Dick noticed that while they talked one of the men never ceased to cover him with a rifle. They were good humored and kindly, but he knew they would not relax an inch from their duty. "All right," he said, "go ahead. I'll give you a good legal title to everything you may find." He knew that the letter was lying in the bushes within 10 feet of them, and he had a strong temptation to look in that direction and see if it were as securely hidden as he had thought, but he resisted the impulse. Two of the men searched him rapidly and dexterously, and much to their disappointment found no dispatch. "You ain't got any writin' on you, that's sure," said the spokesman. "I expected to find a paper, and I had a lingerin' hope, too, that we might find a little tobacco on you in spite of what you said. You don't think I'd lie about the tobacco, would you?" "Sonny, it ain't no lyin' in a big war to say you ain't got no tobacco without them that's achin' for it a standin' by ready to grab it. If you had a big diamond hid about you, and a robber was to ask you if you had it, you'd tell him no, of course." "I think," said Dick, "that you must be from Kentucky. You got our accent." "I shorely am, and I'm a longer way from it than I like. I noticed from the first that you talked like me, which is powerful flatterin' to you. Ain't you one of my brethren that the evil witches have made take up with the Yankees?" "I'm from the same state," replied Dick, who saw no reason to conceal his identity. "My name is Richard Mason, and I'm an aide on the staff of Colonel Arthur Winchester, who commands a Kentucky regiment in General Grant's army." "I've heard of Colonel Winchester, the same that got a part of his regiment cut up so bad by Forrest." "Yes, we did get cut up. I was there," confessed Dick a little reluctantly. "Don't feel bad about it. It's likely to happen to any of you when Forrest is around. Now, since you've introduced yourself so nice, I'll introduce myself. I'm Sergeant Robertson in the Orphan Brigade. It's a Kentucky brigade, and it gets its nickname 'cause it's made up of boys so young that they call me Grandpa, though I'm only 44. These other three are Bridge, Perkins, and Connor, just plain privates." The three just plain privates grinned. "What are you going to do with me?" asked Dick. "We're going to give you a pleasant little ride. We killed your hoss, for which I apologize again, but I've got a good one of my own, and you'll jump up behind me." A sudden spatter of rifle fire came from the direction of the Northern pickets. "Them sentinels of yours have funny habits," said Robertson, grinning. "Just bound to hear their guns go off. They're changing the guard now." "How do you know that?" asked Dick. "Oh, I know a heap. I'm a terrible wise man, but being so wise I don't tell all I know or how I happen to know it. Hop on, sonny." "Don't you think I'll be a lot of trouble to you?" said Dick, "riding behind you 30 or 40 miles to your camp?" The four men exchanged glances, and no one answered. The boy felt a sudden chill, and his hair prickled at the roots. He did not know what had caused it, but surely it was a sign of some danger. The night deepened steadily as they were talking. The twilight had gone long since. The last afterglow had faded. The darkness was heavy with warmth. The thick foliage of spring rustled gently. Dick's sensation that something unusual was happening did not depart. The four men, after looking at one another, looked fixedly at Dick. "Sonny," said Robinson, "you ain't got no call to worry about our troubles. As I said, this is a good strong hoss of mine, and it'll carry us just as far as we go and no further." It was an enigmatical reply, and Dick saw that it was useless to ask them questions. Robertson mounted, and Dick, without another word, sprang up behind him. Two of the privates rode up close, one on either side, and the other kept immediately behind. He happened to glance back, and he saw that the man held a drawn pistol on his thigh. He wondered at such extreme precautions, and the ominous feeling increased. "Now, lads," said Robinson to his men, "don't make no more noise than you can help. There ain't much chance that any Yankee scouting party will be out, but if there should be one we don't want to run into them. And as for you, Mr. Mason, you're a nice boy. We all can see that, but just as sure as you let go with a yell or anything like it at any time or under any circumstances, you'll be dead the next second." A sudden fierce note rang in his voice, and Dick, despite all his courage, shuddered. He felt as if a nameless terror all at once threatened not only him but others. His lips and mouth were dry. Robertson spoke softly to his horse, and then rode slowly forward through the deep forest. The others rode with him, never breaking their compact formation, and preserving the utmost silence. Dick did not ask another question. Talk and fellowship were over. Everything before him now was grim and menacing. The dense woods and the darkness hid them so securely that they could not have been seen 20 yards away. But the men rode on at as sure pace as if they knew the ground well. The silence was deep and intense, save for the footsteps of the horses and now and then a night bird in the tall trees calling. Before they had gone very far, a man stopped from a thicket and held up a rifle. 4 men from the Orphan Brigade with the prisoner, said Robertson. Advance with the prisoner, said the picket, and the 4 men rode forward. Dick saw to both left and right other pickets, all in the gray uniform of the South, and his heart grew cold within him. The hair on his head prickled again at its roots, and it was a dreadful sensation. What did it mean? Why these Southern pickets within cannon shot of the Northern lines? The men rode slowly on. They were in the deep forest, but the young prisoner began to see many things under the leafy canopy. On his right the dim, shadowy forms of hundreds of men lay sleeping on the grass. On his left was massed battery of great guns, 8 in number. Further and further they went, and there were soldiers and cannon everywhere, but not a fire. There was no bed of coals. Not a single torch gleamed anywhere. Not all the soldiers were sleeping, but those who were awake never spoke. Silence and darkness brooded over a great army in gray. It was as if they marched among 40,000 phantoms, row on row. The whole appalling truth burst in an instant upon the boy. The Southern army, which they had supposed was at Corinth, lay in the deep woods within cannon shot of its foe, and not a soul in all of Grant's thousands knew of its presence there. And Buell was still far away. It seemed to Dick that for a little space his heart stopped beating. He foresaw it all, the terrible hammer-stroke at dawn, the rush of the fiery South upon her unsuspecting foe, and the cutting down of brigades before sleep was gone from their eyes. Not in vain had the South boasted that Johnston was a great general. He had not been daunted by Donelson. While his foe rested on his victory and took his ease, he was here, with a new army, ready to strike the unwary. Dick shivered suddenly, and with a violent impulse clutched the waist of the man in front of him. It may have been some sort of physical telepathy, but Robertson understood. He turned his head and said in a whisper, "You're right. The whole Southern army is here in the woods, and we'd rather lose a brigade tonight than let you escape." Dick felt a thrill of the most acute agony. If he could only escape! There must be some way, if he could but find one. His single word would save the lives of thousands and prevent irreparable defeat. Again he clutched the waist of the man in front of him, and again the man divined. "It ain't no use," he said, though his tone was gentle and in a way sympathetic. "After all, it's your own fault. You blundered right in our way, and we had to take you for fear you'd see us and give the alarm. It was your unlucky chance. You'd give $1 million if you had it to slip out of our hands and tell Ulysses Grant that Albert Sidney Johnston with his whole army is laying in the woods right alongside of him, ready to jump on his back at dawn, and he not knowing it." "I would," said Dick fervently. "And so would I if I was in your place. Just think, Mr. Mason, that of all the hundreds of thousands of men in the Northern armies, of all the 20 or 25 million people on the Northern side, there's just one. That one a boy, and that boy you, who knows that Albert Sidney Johnston is here. Held fast as I am, I'm sorry now that I do know it. Can't say that I blame you. I said you'd give $1 million to be able to tell, but if you're to measure such things with money, it'd be worth 100 million and more. Yes, it would be cheap at 300 or 400 million for the North to know it. But after all, you can't measure such things with money. Maybe you think I talk a heap, but I'm stirred some too." They rode on a little farther over the hilly ground, covered with thick forest or dense tall scrub. But there were troops everywhere, and now and then the batteries. They were mostly boys, like their antagonists of the North, and the sleep of most of them was the sleep of exhaustion after a forced and rapid march over heavy ground from Corinth. But Dick knew that they would be fresh in the morning when they rose from the forest and rushed upon their unwarned foe. Chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of The Guns of Shiloh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 14. The Dark Eve of Shiloh. Dick noticed as they went further into the forest how complete was the concealment of a great army, possible only in a country wooded so heavily, and in the presence of a careless enemy. The center was like the front of the Southern force. Not a fire burned, not a torch gleamed. The horses were withdrawn so far that stamp or neigh could not be heard by the Union pickets. "We'll stop here," said Robertson at length. "As you're a Kentuckian, I thought it would be pleasanter for you to be handed over to Kentuckians. The orphan brigade to which I belong is laying on the ground right in front of us, and the 1st Regiment is that of Colonel Kenton. I'll hand you over to him, and not 'cause I've got anything against you. I'll be mighty glad to do it, too, 'cause my back is already nigh breaking with the responsibility." Dick started violently. "What's hit you?" asked Robertson. "Oh, nothing. You see, I'm nervous." "You ain't telling the truth. But I don't blame you, and it don't matter anyway. Here we are. Jump down." Dick sprang to the ground, and the others followed. While they held the reins, they stood in a close circle about him. He had about as much chance of escape as he had of flying. Robertson walked forward, saluted someone who stood up in the dark, and said a few words in a low tone. "Bring him forward," said a clear voice, which Dick recognized at once. The little group of men opened out, and Dick, stepping forth, met his uncle face to face. It was now the time of Colonel George Kenton to start violently. "My God! You, Dick!" he exclaimed. "How did you come here?" "I didn't come," replied the boy, who was now feeling more at ease. "I was brought here by 4 scouts of yours, who I must say saw their duty and did it." Colonel Kenton grasped his hand and shook it. He was very fond of this young nephew of his. The mere fact that he was on the other side did not alter his affection. "Tell me about it, Dick," he said. "And you, Sergeant Robertson, you and your men are to be thanked for your vigilance and activity. You can go off duty. You are entitled to your rest." As they withdrew, the sergeant, who passed by Dick and who had not missed a word of the conversation between him and his uncle, said to him, "At least, young sir, I've returned you to your relatives, and you're a minor, as I can see." "It's so," said Dick as the sergeant passed on. "They have not ill-treated you?" said Colonel Kenton. "No, they've been as kind as one enemy could be to another." "It is strange, most strange, that you and I should meet here at such a time. Nay, Dick, I see in it the hand of Providence. You are to be saved from what will happen to your army tomorrow." "I'd rather not be saved in this manner." "I know it, but it is perhaps the only way. As sure as the stars are in heaven, your army will be destroyed in the morning, and you'd be destroyed with it. I'm fond of you, Dick, and so I'd rather you'd be in our rear, a prisoner, while this is happening. General Grant is a hard man to crush." "Dick, lad, you don't know what you're talking about. Look at the thing as it stands. We know everything that you're doing. Our spies look into the very heart of your camp. You think that we are 50 miles away, but a cannon shot from the center of our camp would reach the center of yours. Why, while we are here, ready to spring, this Grant, of whom you think so much, is on his way tonight to the little village of Savannah to confer with Buell. In the dawn, when we strike and roll his brigades back, he will not be here, and that's your great general." Dick knew that his uncle was excited, but he had full cause to be. There was everything in the situation to inflame an officer's pride and anticipation. It was not too dark for Dick to see a spark leap from his eyes and a sudden flush of red appear in either tanned cheek. But for Dick the chill came again, and once more his hair prickled at the roots. The ambush was even more complete than he had supposed, and General Grant would not be there when it was sprung. "Dick," said Colonel Kenton, "I have talked to you as I would not have talked to anyone else, but even so I would not have talked to you as I have were not your escape an impossibility. You are unharmed, but to leave this camp you would have to fly." "I admit it, sir." "Come with me. There are men higher in rank than I who would wish to see a prisoner taken as you were." Dick followed him willingly and without a word. Aware that he was not in the slightest physical danger, he was full of curiosity concerning what he was about to see. The words, "men higher in rank than I," whipped his blood. Colonel Kenton led through the darkness to a deep and broad ravine, into which they descended. The sides and bottom of this ravine were clothed in bushes, and they grew thick on the edges above. It was much darker here, but Dick presently caught ahead of him the flicker of the first light that he had seen in the Southern army. The boy's heart began to beat fast and hard. All the omens foretold that he was about to witness something that he could never by any possibility forget. They came nearer to the flickering light, and he made out seated figures around it. They were men wrapped in cavalry cloaks, because the night air had grown somewhat chill, and Dick knew instinctively that these were the Southern generals preparing for the hammer stroke at dawn. A sentinel, rifle in hand, met them. Colonel Kenton whispered with him a moment, and he went to the group. He returned in a moment, and escorted Dick and his uncle forward. Colonel Kenton saluted, and Dick involuntarily did the same. It was a small fire, casting only a faint and flickering light, but Dick, his eyes now used to the dusk, saw well the faces of the generals. He knew at once which was Johnston, the chief. He seemed older than the rest, 60 at least, but his skin was clear and ruddy, and the firm face and massive jaw showed thought and power. Yet the countenance appeared gloomy, as if overcast with care. Perhaps it was another omen. By the side of Johnston sat a small but muscular man, swarthy and in early middle years. His face and gestures when he talked showed clearly that he was of Latin blood. It was Beauregard, the victor of Bull Run, now second in command here, and he made a striking contrast to the stern and motionless Kentuckian who sat beside him and who was his chief. There was no uneasy play of Johnston's hands, no shrugging of the shoulders, no jerking of the head. He sat silent, his features a mask, while he listened to his generals. On the other side was Braxton Bragg, brother-in-law of Jefferson Davis, who could never forget Bragg's kinship, and the service that he had done 15 years before at Buena Vista, when he had broken with his guns the last of Santa Anna's squares, deciding the victory. By the side of him was Hardee, the famous tactician, taught in the best schools of both America and Europe. Then there was Polk, who, when a youth, had left the army to enter the church and become a bishop, and who was now a soldier again and a general. Next to the bishop general sat the man who had been vice president of the United States, and who, if the democracy had held together, would now have been in the chair of Lincoln, John C. Breckinridge, called by his people the Magnificent, commonly accounted the most splendid-looking man in America. "Bring the prisoner forward, Colonel Kenton," said General Johnston, a general upon whom the South, with justice, rested great hopes. Dick stepped forward at once, and he held himself firmly, as he felt the eyes of the 6 generals bent upon him. He was conscious even at the moment that chance had given him a great opportunity. He was there to see, while the military genius of the South planned in the shadow of a dark ravine a blow which the 6 intended to be crushing. "Where was the prisoner taken?" said Johnston to Colonel Kenton. "Sergeant Robertson and 3 other men of my command seized him as he was about to enter the Northern lines. He was coming from the direction of Buell, where it is likely that he had gone to take a dispatch." "Did you find any answer upon him?" "My men searched him carefully, sir, but found nothing." "He is in the uniform of a staff officer. Have you found to what regiment in the Union army he belongs?" "He is on the staff of Colonel Arthur Winchester, who commands one of the Kentucky regiments. I have also to tell you, sir, that his name is Richard Mason, and that he is my nephew." "Ah," said General Johnston, "it is one of the misfortunes of civil war that so many of us fight against our own relatives. For those who live in the border states, yours is the common lot." But Dick was conscious that the 6 generals were gazing at him with renewed interest. "Your surmise about his having been to Buell is no doubt correct," said Beauregard quickly and nervously. "You left General Buell this morning, did you not, Mr. Mason?" Dick remained silent. "It is also true that Buell's army is worn down by his heavy march over muddy roads," continued Beauregard as if he had not noticed Dick's failure to reply. Dick's teeth were shut firmly and he compressed his lips. He stood rigidly erect, gazing now at the flickering flames of the little fire. "I suggest that you try him on some other subject than Buell, General Beauregard," said the bishop general, a faint twinkle appearing in his eyes. Johnston sat silent, but his blue eyes missed nothing. "It is true also, is it not," continued Beauregard, "that General Grant has gone or is going tonight to Savannah to meet General Buell and confer with him about a speedy advance upon our army at Corinth?" Dick clenched his teeth harder than ever, and a spasm passed over his face. He was conscious that 6 pairs of eyes, keen and intent, ready to note the slightest change of countenance and to read a meaning into it, were bent upon him. It was only by a supreme effort that he remained master of himself, but after the single spasm his countenance remained unmoved. "You do not choose to answer," said Bragg, always a stern and ruthless man, "but we can drag what you know from you." "I am a prisoner of war," replied Dick steadily. "I was taken in full uniform. I am no spy, and you cannot ill-treat me." "I do not mean that we would inflict any physical suffering upon you," said Bragg. "The Confederacy does not, and will never, resort to such methods. But you are only a boy. We can question you here, until, through very weakness of spirit, you will be glad to tell us all you know about Buell's or any other Northern force." "Try me, and see," said Dick proudly. The blue eye of the silent Johnston flickered for an instant. "But it is true," said Beauregard, resuming his role of cross-examiner, "that your army, considering itself secure, has not fortified against us? It has dug no trenches, built no earthworks, thrown up no abatis?" The boy stood silent with folded arms, and Colonel George Kenton, standing on one side, threw his nephew a glance of sympathy, tinged with admiration. "Still you do not answer," continued Beauregard, and now a strong note of irony appeared in his tone, "but perhaps it is just as well. You do your duty to your own army, and we miss nothing. You cannot tell us anything that we do not know already. Whatever you may know, we know more. We know tonight the condition of General Grant's army better than General Grant himself does. We know how General Buell and his army stand better than General Buell himself does. We know the position of your brigades and the missing links between them better than your own brigade commanders do." The eyes of the Louisianian flashed, his swarthy face swelled, and his shoulders twitched. The French blood was strong within him. Just so might some general of Napoleon, some general from the Midi, have shown his emotion on the eve of battle, an emotion which did not detract from courage and resolution. But the Puritan general, Johnston, raised a deprecatory hand. "It is enough, General Beauregard," he said. "The young prisoner will tell us nothing. That is evident. As he sees his duty, he does it, and I wish that our young men, when they are taken, may behave as well. Mr. Mason, you are excused. You remain in the custody of your uncle, but I warn you that there is none who will guard better against the remotest possibility of your escape." It was involuntary, but Dick gave his deepest military salute, and said in a tone of mingled admiration and respect, "General Johnston, I thank you." The commander-in-chief of the Southern army bowed courteously in return, and Dick, following his uncle, left the ravine. The 6 generals returned to their council, and the boy who would not answer was quickly forgotten. Long they debated the morrow. Several have left accounts of what occurred. Johnston, although he had laid the remarkable ambush and was expecting victory, was grave, even gloomy. But Beauregard, volatile and sanguine, rejoiced. For him the triumph was won already. After their achievement in placing their army, unseen and unknown, within cannon shot of the Union force, failure was to him impossible. Breckinridge, like his chief, Johnston, was also grave and did not say much. Hardee, as became one of his severe military training, discussed the details, the placing of the brigades and the time of attack by each. Polk, the bishop general, and Bragg also had their part. As they talked in low tones they moved the men over their chessboard. Now and then an aide was summoned and soon departed swiftly and in silence to move a battery or a regiment a little closer to the Union lines, but always he carried the injunction that no noise be made. Not a sound that could be heard 300 yards away came from all that great army, lying there in the deep woods and poised for its spring. Meanwhile, security reigned in the Union camp. The farm lads of the West and Northwest had talked much over their fires. They had eaten good suppers, and by they fell asleep. But many of the officers still sat by the coals and discussed the march against the Southern army at Corinth, when the men of Buell should join those of Grant. The pickets, although the gaps yet remained between those of the different brigades, walked back and forth and wondered at the gloom and intensity of the woods in front of them, but did not dream of that which lay in the heart of the darkness. The Southern generals in the ravine lingered yet a little longer. A diagram had been drawn upon a piece of paper. It showed the position of every Southern brigade, regiment, and battery, and of every Northern division, too. It showed every curve of the Tennessee, the winding lines of the 3 creeks, Owl, Lick, and Snake, and the hills and marshes. The last detail of the plan was agreed upon finally, and they made it very simple, lest their brigades and regiments should lose touch and become confused in the great forest. They were to attack continually by the right, press the Union army toward the right always, in order to rush in and separate it from Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee, and from the fleet and its stores. Then they meant to drive it into the marshes enclosed by the river and Snake Creek and destroy it. The 6 generals rose, leaving the little fire to sputter out. General Johnston was very grave, and so were all the others as they started toward their divisions, except Beauregard, who said in sanguine tones, "Gentlemen, we shall sleep tomorrow night in the enemy's camp." Word, in the mysterious ways of war, had slid through the camp that the generals were in council, and many soldiers, driven by overwhelming curiosity, had crept through the underbrush to watch the figures by the fire in the ravine. They could not hear, they did not seek to hear, but they were held by a sort of spell. When they saw them separate, every one moving toward his own headquarters, they knew that there was nothing to await now but the dawn, and they stole back toward their own headquarters. Dick had gone with Colonel Kenton to his own regiment, in the very heart of the Orphan Brigade, and on his way his uncle said, "Dick, you will sleep among my own lads, and I ask for your own sake to make no attempt to escape tonight. You would certainly be shot." "I recognize that fact, sir, and I shall await a better opportunity. What to do with you in the morning I don't know, but we shall probably be able to take care of you. Meanwhile, Dick, go to sleep if you can. See, our boys are spread here through the woods. If it were day you'd probably find at least a dozen among them whom you know, and certainly 100 are of blood kin to you, more or less." Dick saw the dim forms stretched in hundreds on the ground, and thanking his uncle for his kindness, he stretched himself upon an unoccupied bit of turf and closed his eyes. But it was impossible for young Richard Mason to sleep. He felt again that terrible thrill of agony because he alone of all the score and more of Northern millions knew that the Southern trap was about to fall, and he could not tell. Never was he further from sleep. His nerves quivered with actual physical pain. He opened his eyes again and saw the dim forms lying in row on row as far in the forest as his eye could reach. Then he listened. He might hear the rifle of some picket, more wary or more enterprising than the others, sounding the alarm. But no such sound came to his ears. It had turned warmer again, and he heard only the southern wind, heavy with the odors of grass and flower, sighing through the tall forest. An anger against his own surged up in his breast. Why wouldn't they look? How could they escape seeing? Was it possible for one great army to remain unknown within cannon shot of another a whole night? It was incredible, but he had seen it and he knew it. Fierce and bitter words rose to his lips, but he did not utter them. Dick lay a long time with his eyes open, and the night was passing as peacefully as if there would be no red dawn. Occasionally he heard a faint stir near him as some restless soldier turned on his side in his sleep, and now and then a muttered word from an officer who passed near in the darkness. Hours never passed more slowly. Colonel Kenton had gone back toward the Northern lines, and the boy surmised that he would be one of the first in the attack at dawn. He began to wonder if dawn would ever really come. Stars and a fair moon were out, and as nearly as he could judge from them it must be about 3 o'clock in the morning. Yet it seemed to him that he had been lying there at least 12 hours. He shut his eyes again, but sleep was as far from him as ever. After another long and almost unendurable period he opened them once more, and it seemed to him that there was a faint tint of gray in the east. He sat up, and looking a long time, he was sure of it. The gray was deepening and broadening, and at its center it showed a tint of silver. The dawn was at hand, and every nerve in the boy's body thrilled with excitement and apprehension. A murmur and a shuffling sound arose all around him. The sleepers were awake, and they stood up, thousands of them. Cold food was given to them, and they ate it hastily. But they fondled their rifles and muskets, and turned their faces toward the point where the Northern army lay, and from which no sound came. Dick shivered all over. His head burned and his nerves throbbed. Too late now. He had hoped all through the long night that something would happen to carry a warning to that unsuspecting army. Nothing had happened, and in 5 minutes the attack would begin. He stood up at his full height and sought to pierce with his eyes the foliage in front of him, but the massed ranks of the Southerners now stood between, and the batteries were wheeling into line. A great throb and murmur ran through the forest. Dick looked upon faces brown with the sun, and eyes gleaming with the fierce passion of victory and revenge. They were going to avenge Henry and Donelson and all the long and mortifying retreat from Kentucky. Dick saw them straining and looking eagerly at their officers for the word to advance. As if by a concerted signal the long and mellow peal of many trumpets came from the front. The officers uttered the shout to charge, the wild and terrible rebel yell swelled from 40,000 throats, and the Southern army rushed upon its foe. The red dawn of Shiloh had come. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15, Part 1 of The Guns of Shiloh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 15, The Red Dawn of Shiloh, Part 1. Dick stood appalled when he heard the terrible shout in the dawn and the crash of cannon and rifles rolling down upon the Union lines. It was already a shout of triumph, and as he gazed he saw through the woods the red line of flame sweeping on without a halt. The surprise had been complete. Hardee, leading the Southern advance, struck Peabody's Northern brigade and smashed it up instantly. The men did not even have time to seize their rifles. They had no chance to form into ranks, and the officers themselves, as they shouted commands, were struck down. Men, killed or wounded, were falling everywhere. Almost before they had time to draw a free breath, the remnants of the brigade were driven upon those behind it. Hardee also rushed upon Sherman, but there he found a foe of tough metal. The man who had foreseen the enormous extent of the war, although taken by surprise too, did not lose his courage or presence of mind. His men had time to seize their arms, and he formed a hasty line of battle. He also had the forethought to send word to the general in his rear to close up the gap between him and the next general in the line. Then he shifted one of his own brigades until there was a ravine in front of it to protect his men, and he hurried a battery to his flank. Never was Napoleon's maxim that men are nothing, a man is everything, more justified. And never did the genius of Sherman shine more brilliantly than on that morning. It was he, alone, cool of mind and steady in the face of overwhelming peril, who first faced the Southern rush. He inspired his troops with his own courage, and though pale of face, they bent forward to meet the red whirlwind that was rushing down upon them. Like a blaze running through dry grass, the battle extended in almost an instant along the whole front, and the deep woods were filled with the roar of 80,000 men in conflict. And Grant, as at Donelson, was far away. The thunder and blaze of the battle increased swiftly and to a frightful extent. The Southern generals, eager, alert, and full of success, pushed in all their troops. The surprised Northern army was giving way at all points except where Sherman stood. Hardee continued his rush, broke the Northern line asunder, and his brigades, wrapping themselves around Sherman, strove to destroy him. Although he saw his lines crumbling away before him, Sherman never flinched. The ravine in front of him and rough ground on one side defended him to a certain extent. The men fired their rifles as fast as they could load and reload, and the cannon on their flanks never ceased to pour shot and shell into the ranks of their opponents. The gunners were shot down, but new ones rose at once in their places. The fiercest conflict yet seen on American soil was raging here. North would not yield. South ever rushed anew to the attack, and a vast cloud of mingled flame and smoke enclosed them both. Dick had stood as if petrified, staring at the billows of flame, while the thunder of great armies in battle stunned his ears. He realized suddenly that he was alone. Colonel Kenton had said the night before that he did not know what to do with him, but that he would find a way in the morning. But he had been forgotten, and he knew it was natural that he should be. His fate was but a trifle in the mighty event that was passing. There was no time for anyone in the Southern army to bother about him. And then he understood, too, that he was free. The whole orphan brigade had passed on into the red heart of the battle and had left him there alone. Now his mind leaped out of its paralysis. All his senses became alert. In that vast whirlwind of fire and smoke, no one would notice that a single youth was stealing through the forest in an effort to rejoin his own people. Action followed swift upon thought. He curved about in the woods, and then ran rapidly toward the point where the fire seemed thinnest. He did not check his pace until he had gone at least a mile, and then he paused to see if he could tell how the battle was going. Its roar seemed louder than ever in his ears, and in front of him was a vast red line which extended an unseen distance through the forest. Now and then the wild and thrilling rebel yell rose above the roar of cannon and the crash of rifles. Dick saw with a sinking of the heart, and yet he had known that it would be so, that the red line of flame had moved deeper into the heart of the Northern camp. It had passed the Northern outposts, and at many points it had swept over the Northern center. He feared that there was but a huddled and confused mass beyond it. He saw something lying at his feet. It was a Confederate military cloak which some officer had cast off as he rushed to the charge. He picked it up, threw it about his own shoulders, and then tossed away his cap. If he fell in with Confederate troops, they would not know him from one of their own, and it was no time now to hold cross-examinations. He took a wide curve, and after another mile came to a hillock, upon which he stood a little while panting. And again he was appalled at the sight he beheld. Bull Run and Donelson were small beside this. Here 80,000 men were locked fast in furious conflict. Raw and undisciplined many of these farmer lads of the West and South were, but in battle they showed a courage and tenacity not surpassed by the best trained troops that ever lived. The floating smoke reached Dick where he stood, stung his eyes, and a powerful odor of burned gunpowder assailed his nostrils, but neither sight nor odors held him back. Instead, they drew him on with overwhelming force. He must rejoin his own and do his best, however little it counted in the whole. It was now well on into the morning of a brilliant and hot Sunday. He did not know it, but the combat was raging fiercest then around the little church which should have been sacred. Drawing a deep breath of an air which was shot with fire and smoke, and which was hot to his lungs, Dick began to run again. Almost before he noticed it, he was running by the side of a Southern regiment which had been ordered to veer about and attack some new point in the Northern line. Keeping his presence of mind, he shouted with them as they rushed on, and presently dropped away from them in the smoke. He was conscious now of a new danger. Twigs and bits of bark began to rain down upon him, and he heard the unpleasant whistle of bullets over his head. They were the bullets of his own people, seeking to repel the Southern charge. A minute later a huge shell burst near him, covering him with flying earth. At first he thought he had been hit by fragments of the shell, but when he shook himself he found that he was all right. He took yet a wider curve, and before he was aware of the treacherous ground, plunged into a swamp bordering one of the creeks. He stood for a few moments in mud and water to his waist, but he knew that he had passed from the range of the Union fire. Twigs and bark no longer fell around him, and that most unpleasant whiz of bullets was gone. He pulled himself out of the mire and ran along the edge of the creek toward the roar of the battle. He knew now that he had passed around the flank of the Southern army and could approach the flank of his own. He ran fast and then began to hear bullets again, but now they were coming from the Southern army. He threw away the cloak, and presently he emerged into a mass of men who, under the continual urging of their officers, were making a desperate defense, firing, drawing back, reloading and firing again. In front the woods swarmed with the Southern troops who drove incessantly upon them. Dick snatched up a rifle, plenty were lying upon the ground where the owners had fallen with them, and fired into the attacking ranks. Then he reloaded swiftly and pressed on toward the Union center. "What troops are these?" he asked of an officer who was knotting a handkerchief about a bleeding wrist. "From Illinois. Who are you?" "I'm Lieutenant Richard Mason of Colonel Arthur Winchester's Kentucky regiment. I was taken prisoner by the enemy last night, but I escaped this morning. Do you know where my regiment is?" "Keep straight on and you'll strike it, or what's left of it, if anything at all is left. It's a black day." Dick scarcely caught his last words as he dashed on through bullets, shell and solid shot, over slain men and horses, over dismantled guns and gun carriages, and into the very heart of the flame and smoke. The thunder of battle was at its height now. because he was in the center of it. The roar of the great guns was continuous, but the unbroken crash of rifles by the scores of thousands was fiercer and more deadly. The officer had pointed toward the Kentucky regiment with his sword, and following the line, Dick ran directly into it. The very first face he saw was that of Colonel Winchester. "Dick, my lad," shouted the colonel, "where have you come from?" "From the Southern army. I was taken prisoner last night, almost within sight of our own, but when they charged this morning they forgot me, and here I am." Colonel Winchester suddenly seized him by the shoulders and pushed him down. The regiment was behind a small ridge which afforded some protection, and all were lying down except the senior officers. "Welcome, Dick, to our hot little camp. The chances are about 100% out of 100% that this is the hottest place on earth today." The long, thin figure of Warner lay pressed against the ground. A handkerchief stained red was bound about his head, and his face was pale, but indomitable courage gleamed from his eyes. Just beyond him was Pennington, unhurt. "Thank God you haven't fallen, and that I've found you," exclaimed Dick. "I don't know whether you're so lucky after all," said Warner. "The Johnnies have been mowing us down. They dropped on us so suddenly this morning that they must have been sleeping in the same bed with us last night, and we didn't know it. I hear that we're routed nearly everywhere except here and where Sherman stands. Look out! Here they come again!" They saw tanned faces and fierce eyes through the smoke, and the bullets swept down on them in showers. Lucky for them that the little ridge was there, and that they had made up their minds to stand to the last. They replied with their own deadly fire, yet many fell despite the shelter, and to both left and right the battle swelled afresh. Dick felt again that rain of bark and twigs and leaves. Sometimes a tree, cut through at its base by cannon balls, fell with a crash. Along the whole curving line the Southern generals ever urged forward their valiant troops. And now the courage and skill of Sherman shone supreme. Dick saw him often striding up and down the lines, ordering and begging his men to stand fast, although they were looking almost into the eyes of their enemies. The conflict became hand to hand, and assailant and assailed reeled to and fro. But Sherman would not give up. The fiercest attacks broke in vain on his iron front. McClernand, with whom he had quarreled the day before as to who should command the army while Grant was away, came up with reinforcements, and seeing what the fearless and resolute general had done, yielded him the place. The last of the charges broke for the time upon Sherman, and his exhausted regiment uttered a shout of triumph. But on both sides of him the Southern troops drove their enemy back and yet further back. Breckinridge, along with Lick Creek, was pushing everything before him. The bishop general was doing well. Many of the Northern troops had not yet recovered from their surprise. A general and 3 whole regiments, struck on every side, were captured. It seemed that nothing could deprive the Southern army of victory, absolute and complete. General Johnston had marshaled his troops with superb skill, and intending to reap the full advantage of the surprise, he continually pushed them forward upon the shattered Northern lines. He led in person and on horseback the attack upon the Federal center. Around and behind him rode his staff, and the wild rebel yell swept again through the forest, when the soldiers saw the stern and lofty features of the chief whom they trusted leading them on. But fate, in the very moment of triumph that seemed overwhelming and sure, was preparing a terrible blow for the South. A bullet struck Johnston in the ankle. His boot filled with blood, and the wound continued to bleed fast. But despite the urging of his surgeon, who rode with him, he refused to dismount and have the wound bound up. How could he dismount at such a time, when the battle was at its height and the Union army was being driven into the creeks and swamps? He was wounded again by a piece of shell, and he sank dying from his horse. His officers crowded around him, seeking to hide their irreparable loss from the soldiers, the most costly death, with the exception of Stonewall Jackson's, sustained by the Confederacy in the whole war. But the troops, borne on by the impetus that success and the spirit of Johnston had given them, drove harder than ever against the Northern line. They crashed through it in many places, seizing prisoners and cannon. Almost the whole Northern camp was now in their possession, and many of the Southern lads, hungry from scanty rations, had stopped to seize the plenty that they found there. But enough persisted to give the Northern army no rest, and press it back nearer and nearer to the marshes. End of chapter 15, part 1. Chapter 15, Part 2 of The Guns of Shiloh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 15. The Red Dawn of Shiloh, Part 2. The combat redoubled around Sherman. Johnston was gone, but his generals still shared his resolution. They turned an immense fire upon the point where stood Sherman and McClernand, now united by imminent peril. Their ranks were searched by shot and shell, and the bullets whizzed among them like a continuous swarm of hornets. Dick was still unwounded, but so much smoke and vapor had drifted about his face that he was compelled at times to rub his eyes that he might see. He felt a certain dizziness, too, and he did not know whether the incessant roaring in his ears came wholly from the cannon and rifle fire or partly from the pounding of his blood. "I feel that we are shaking," he shouted in the ears of Warner, who lay next to him. "I'm afraid we're going to give ground." "I feel it, too," Warner shouted back. "We've been here for hours, but we're shot to pieces. Half of our men must be killed or wounded. But how old Sherman fights!" The Southern leaders brought up fresh troops and hurled them upon Sherman. Again the combat was hand to hand, and to the right and left the supports of the indomitable Northern general were being cut away. Those brigades who had proved their mettle at Donelson and who had long stood fast were attacked so violently that they gave way, and the victors hurled themselves upon Sherman's flank. Dick and his two young comrades perceived through the flame and smoke the new attack. It seemed to Dick that they were being enclosed now by the whole Southern army, and he felt a sense of suffocation. He was dizzy from such a long and terrible strain and so much danger, and he was not really more than half conscious. He was loading and firing his rifle mechanically, but he always aimed at something in the red storm before him, although he never knew whether he hit or missed, and was glad of it. The division of Sherman had been standing there 7 hours, sustaining with undaunted courage the resolute attacks of the Southern army. But the sixth sense, warning Dick that it had begun to shake at last, was true. The sun had now passed the zenith and was pouring intense and fiery rays upon the field, sometimes piercing the clouds of smoke and revealing the faces of the men, black with sweat and burned gunpowder. A cry arose for Grant. Why did not their chief show himself upon the field? Was so great a battle to be fought with him away? And where was Buell? He had a second great army. He was to join them that day. What good would it be for him to come tomorrow? Many of them laughed in bitter derision. And there was Lew Wallace, too. They had heard that he was near the field with a strong division. Then why did he not come upon it and face the enemy? Again they laughed, that fierce and bitter laugh deep down in their throats. The attack upon Sherman never ceased for an instant. Now he was assailed not only from the front but from both flanks, and some even gaining the rear struck blows upon his division there. One brigade upon his left was compelled to give way, scattered and lost its guns. The right wing was also driven in, and the center yielded slowly, although retaining its cohesion. The three lads were on their feet now, and it seemed to them that everything was lost. They could see the battle in front of them only, but rumors came to them that the army was routed elsewhere. But neither Sherman nor McClernand would yield, save for the slow retreat, yielding ground foot by foot only. And there were many unknown heroes around them. Sergeant Whitley blazed with courage and spirit. "We could be worse off than we are," he shouted to Dick. "General Buell's army may yet come." "Maybe we could be worse off than we are, but I don't see how it's possible," shouted Dick in return, a certain grim humor possessing him for the moment. "Look, what I said has come true already," shouted the sergeant. "Here is shelter that will help us to make a new stand." In their slow retreat they reached two low hills between which a small ravine ran. It was not a strong position, but Sherman used it to the utmost. His men fired from the protecting crests of the hills, and he filled the ravine with riflemen, who poured a deadly fire upon the assailants. Now Sherman ordered them to stand fast to the last man, because it was by this road that the division of Lew Wallace must come, if it come at all. But the Southern brigades followed them, and the battle raged anew, as fierce and deadly as ever. Although their army was routed at many points, the Northern officers showed indomitable courage. Driven back in the forest, they always strove to form the lines anew, and now their efforts began to show some success. Their resistance on the right hardened, and on the left they held fast to the chain of hills that covered the wharves and their stores at the river landing. As they took position here, 2 gunboats in the river began to send huge shells over their heads at the attacking Southern columns, maintaining a rapid and heavy fire which shook assailants and strengthened defenders. Again the water had come to the help of the North, and at the most critical moment. The whole Northern line was now showing a firmer front, and Grant himself was directing the battle. Fortune, which had played a game with Grant at Donelson, played a far greater one with him on the far greater field of Shiloh. The red dawn of Shiloh, when Johnston was sweeping his army before him, had found him at Savannah, far from the field of battle. The hardy and vigorous Nelson had arrived there in the night with Buell's vanguard, and Grant had ordered to march at speed the next day to join his own army. But he himself did not reach the field of Shiloh until 10 o'clock, when the fiercest battle yet known on the American continent had been raging for several hours. Grant and his staff, as they rode away from his headquarters, heard the booming of cannon in the direction of Shiloh. Some of them thought it was a mere skirmish, but it came continuously, like rolling thunder, and their trained ears told them that it rose from a line miles in length. One seeks to penetrate the mind of a commanding general at such a time, and see what his feelings were. Again the battle had been joined, and was at its height, and he away. Those trained ears told him also that the rolling thunder of the cannon was steadily moving toward them. It could mean only that the Northern army had been driven from its camp, and that the Southern army was pushing its victory to the utmost. In those moments his agony must have been intense. His great army not only attacked, but beaten, and he not there. He and his staff urged their horses forward, seeking to gain from them new ounces of speed. But the country was difficult, the hills were rough, and there were swamps and mire. And as they listened, the roar of the battle steadily came nearer and nearer. There was no break in the Northern retreat. The sweat, not of heat, but of mental agony, stood upon their faces. Grant was not the only one who suffered. Now they met some of the stragglers who flee from every battlefield, no matter what the nation. Their faces were white with fear, and they cried out that the Northern army was destroyed. Officers cursed them and struck at them with the flats of their swords, but they dodged the blows and escaped into the bushes. There was no time to pursue them. Grant and his staff never ceased to ride toward the storm of battle which raged far and wide around the little church of Shiloh. The stream of fugitives increased, and now they saw swarms of men who stood here and there, not running, but huddled and irresolute. Never did Fortune, who brought this, her favorite, from the depths, bring him again in her play so near to the verge of destruction. When he came upon the field, the battle seemed wholly lost, and the whole world would have cried that he was to blame. But the bulldog in Grant was never of stauncher breed than on that day. His face turned white, and he grew sick at the sight of the awful slaughter. A bullet broke the small sword at his side, but he did not flinch. Preserving the stern calm that always marked him on the field, he began to form his lines anew and strengthen the weaker points. Yet the condition of his army would have appalled a weaker will. It had been driven back 3 miles. His whole camp had been taken. His second line also had been driven in. Many thousands of men had fallen, and other thousands had been taken. 30 of his cannon were in the hands of the enemy, and although noon had now come and gone, there was no sound to betoken the coming of the troops led by Wallace or Nelson. Well might Grant's own stout heart have shrunk appalled from the task before him. Wallace was held back by confused orders, pardonable at such a time. The eager Nelson was detained at Savannah by Buell, who thought that the sounds of the engagement they heard in the Shiloh woods was a minor affair, and who wanted Nelson to wait for boats to take him there. It seemed sometimes to Dick, long afterward, when the whole of the great Shiloh battle became clear, that fortune was merely playing a game of chess, with the earth as a board and the armies as pawns. Grant's army was ambushed, with its general absent. The other armies, which were almost at hand, were delayed for one reason or another, while as for the South, the genius that had planned the attack and that had carried it forward was quenched in death when victory was at its height. But for the present the lad had little time for such thoughts as these. The success of Sherman in holding the new position infused new courage into him and those around him. The men in gray, wearied with their immense exertions, and having suffered frightful losses themselves, abated somewhat the energy and fierceness of their attack. The dissolved Northern regiments had time to reform. Grant seized a new position along a line of hills in front of which ran a deep ravine filled with brushwood. He and his officers appreciated the advantage, and they massed their troops there as fast as they could. Now fortune, after having brought Grant to the verge of the pit, was disposed to throw chance in his way. The hills and the ravine were one. Another, and most important it was the presence of guns of the heaviest caliber landed some days ago from the fleet and left there until their disposition could be determined. A quick-witted colonel, Webster by name, gathered up all the gunners who had lost their own guns and who had been driven back in the retreat, and manned this great battery of siege guns, just as the Southern generals were preparing to break down the last stand of the North. Meanwhile a terrible rumor had been spreading in the ranks of the Southern troops. The word was passed from soldier to soldier that their commander Johnston, whom they had believed invincible, had been killed, and they did not trust so much Beauregard, who was left in command, nor those who helped. Their fiery spirit abated somewhat. There was no decrease of courage, but continuous victory did not seem so easy now. Confusion invaded the triumphant army also. Beauregard had divided the leadership on the field among 3 of his lieutenants. Hardee now urged on the center, Bragg commanded the right, and Polk, the bishop general, led the left. It was Bragg's division that was about to charge the great battery of siege guns that the alert Webster had manned so quickly. 5 minutes more and Webster would have been too late. Here again were the fortunes of Grant brought to the very verge of the pit. The Northern gunboats at the mouth of the Lick Creek moved forward a little, and their guns were ready to support the battery. The Kentucky regiment was wedged in between the battery and a brigade, and it was gasping for breath. Colonel Winchester, slightly wounded in 3 places, commanded his men to lie down, and they gladly threw themselves upon the earth. There was a momentary lull in the battle. Wandering winds caught up the banks of smoke and carried most of them away. Dick, as he rose a little, saw the Southern troops massing in the forest for an attack upon their new position. They seemed to be only a few yards away, and he clearly observed the officers walking along the front of the lines. It flashed upon him that they must hold these hills or Grant's army would perish. Where was Buell? Why did he not come? If the Southerners destroyed one Northern army today, they would destroy another tomorrow. They would break the 2 halves of the Union force in the west into pieces, first one and then the other. "What do you see, Dick?" asked Warner, who was lying almost flat upon his face. "The Confederate army is getting ready to wipe us off the face of the earth. Up with your rifle, George. They'll be upon us in 2 minutes." They heard a sudden shout behind them. It was a glad shout, and well it might be. Nelson, held back by Buell's orders, had listened long to the booming of the cannon off in the direction of Shiloh. Nothing could convince him that a great battle was not going on, and all through the morning he chafed and raged, and as the sound of the cannon grew louder he believed that Grant's army was losing. Nelson obtained Buell's leave at last to march for Shiloh, but it was a long road across hills and creeks and through swamps. The cannon sank deep in the mire, and then the ardent Nelson left them behind. Now he knew there was a great need for haste. The flashing and thundering in front of them showed to the youngest soldier in his command that a great battle was in progress, and that it was going against the North. His division at last reached Pittsburgh Landing and was carried across the river in the steamers. One brigade, led by Ammen, outstripped the rest and rushed in behind the great battery and to its support just as the Southern bugles once more sounded the charge. Dick shouted with joy, too, when he saw the new troops. The next moment the enemy was upon them, charging directly through a frightful discharge from the great guns. The riddled regiments which had fought so long gave way before the bayonets, but the fresh troops took their places and poured a terrible fire into the assaulting columns, and the great guns of the battery hurled a new storm of shell and solid shot. The ranks of the Southern troops, worn by a full day of desperate fighting, were broken. They had crossed the ravine into the very mouths of the Northern guns, but now they were driven back into the ravine and across it. Cannon and rifles rained missiles upon them there, and they withdrew into the woods, while for the first time in all that long day a shout of triumph rose from the Union lines. Another lull came in the battle. "What are they doing now, Dick?" asked the Vermonter. "I can't see very well, but they seem to be gathering in the forest for a fresh attack. Do you know, George, that the sun is almost down? It's certainly time. It's been at least a month since the Johnnies ran out of the forest in the dawn and jumped on us." It was true that the day was almost over, although but few had noticed the fact. The east was already darkening, and a rosy glow from the west fell across the torn forest. Here and there a dead tree, set on fire by the shells, burned slowly, little flames creeping along trunk and boughs. Bragg was preparing to hurl his entire force upon Sherman and the battery. At that moment Beauregard, now his chief, arrived. But a few minutes of daylight were left, and the swarthy Louisianian looked at the great losses in his own ranks. He believed that the army of Buell was so far away that it could not arrive that night, and he withheld the charge. The Southern army withdrew a little into the woods. The night rushed down, and Shiloh's terrible first day was over. End of chapter 15, part 2.
Chapter 16, Part 1 of The Guns of Shiloh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 16, The Fierce Finish of Shiloh, Part 1. Dick, who had been lying under cover just behind the crest of one of the low ridges, suddenly heard the loud beating of his heart. He did not know for a moment or two that the sound came so distinctly because the mighty tumult which had been raging around him all day had ceased, as if by a concerted signal. Those blinding flashes of flame no longer came from the forest before him. The shot and shell quit their horrible screaming, and the air was free from the unpleasant hiss of countless bullets. He stretched himself a little and stood up. The lads all around him were standing up and were beginning to talk to each other in the high-pitched, shouting voices that they had been compelled to use all day long, not yet realizing to the full that the tumult of the battle had ceased. The boy felt stiff and sore in every bone and muscle, and, although the cannon and rifles were silent, there was still a hollow roaring in his ears. His eyes were yet dim from the smoke, and his head felt heavy and dull. He gazed vacantly at the forest in front of him, and wondered dimly why the Southern army was not still there, attacking as it had attacked for so many hours. But the deep woods were silent and empty. Coils and streamers of smoke floated about among the trees, and suddenly a gray squirrel hopped out on a bough and began to chatter wildly. Dick, despite himself, laughed, but the laugh was hysterical. He could appreciate the feelings of the squirrel, which probably had been imprisoned in a hollow of the tree all day long, listening to this tremendous battle, and squirrels were not used to such battles. It was a trifle that made him laugh, but everything was out of proportion now. Life did not go on in the usual way at all. The ordinary occupations were gone, and people spent most of their time trying to kill one another. He rubbed his hands across his eyes and cleared them of the smoke. The battle was certainly over for the day at least, and neither he nor his comrades had sufficient vitality yet to think of the morrow. The twilight was fast deepening into night. The last rosy glow of the sun faded, and thick darkness enveloped the vast forest, in which 20,000 men had fallen, and in which most of them yet lay, the wounded with the dead. There was presently a deep boom from the river, and a shell fired by one of the gunboats curved far over their heads and dropped into the forest, where the Southern army was encamped. All through the night and at short but regular intervals the gunboats maintained this warning fire, heartening the Union soldiers and telling them at every discharge that however they might have to fight for the land, the water was always theirs. Dick saw Colonel Winchester going among his men, and pulling himself together, he saluted his chief. "Any orders, sir?" he said. "No, Dick, my boy, none for the present," replied the colonel a little sadly. "Half of my poor regiment is killed or wounded, and the rest are so exhausted that they are barely able to move. But they fought magnificently, Dick. They had to or be crushed. It is only here that we have withstood the rush of the Southern army, and it is probable that we too would have gone had not night come to our help." "Then we have been beaten?" "Yes, Dick, we have been beaten, and beaten badly. It was the surprise that did it. How on earth we could have let the Southern army creep upon us and strike unaware I don't understand. But Dick, my boy, there will be another battle tomorrow, and it may tell a different tale. Some prisoners whom we have taken say that Johnston has been killed, and Beauregard is no such leader as he." "Will the army of General Buell reach us tonight?" "Buell himself is here. He has been with Grant for some time, and all his brigades are marching at the double quick. Lew Wallace arrived less than half an hour ago with 7,000 men, fresh and eager for battle. Dick, my boy, we'll have 40,000 new troops on the field at the next dawn, and before God we'll wipe out the disgrace of today. Listen to the big guns from the boats as they speak at intervals. Why, I can understand the very words they speak. They are saying to the Southern army, 'Look out! Look out! We're coming in the morning, and it's we who'll attack now.'" Dick saw that Colonel Winchester himself was excited. The pupils of his eyes were dilated, and a red spot glowed in either cheek. Like all the other officers, he was stung by the surprise and defeat, and he could barely wait for the morning and revenge. Colonel Winchester walked away to a council that had been called, and Dick turned to Pennington and Warner, who were not hurt, save for slight wounds. Warner had recovered his poise, and was soon as calm and dry as ever. "Dick," he said, "we're some distance from where we started this morning. There's nothing like being shoved along when you don't want to go. The next time they'll tell me there's nothing in a thicket I expect to search it and find a rebel army at least 100,000 strong right in the middle of it." "How large do you suppose the Southern army was?" asked Pennington. "I had a number of looks at it," replied Warner, "and I should say from the way it acted that it numbered at least 3,000,000 men. I know that at times not less than 10,000 were aiming their rifles at my own poor and unworthy person. What a waste of energy for so many men to shoot at me all at once. I wish the Johnnies would go away and let us alone." The last words were high-pitched and excited. His habitual self-control broke down for a moment, and the tremendous excitement and nervous tension of the day found vent in his voice. But in a few seconds he recovered himself and looked rather ashamed. "Boys," he said, "I apologize." "You needn't," said Pennington. "There have been times today when I felt brave as a lion, and lots of other times I was scared most to death. It would have helped me a lot then if I could have opened my mouth and yelled at the top of my voice." Sergeant Daniel Whitley was leaning against a stump, and while he was calmly lighting a pipe he regarded the three boys with a benevolent gaze. "None of you need be ashamed of being scared," he said. "I've been in a lot of fights myself, though all of them were mere skirmishes when put alongside of this, and I've been scared a heap today. I've been scared for myself, and I've been scared for the regiment, and I've been scared for the whole army, and I've been scared on general principles, but here we are, alive and kicking, and we ought to feel powerful thankful for that." "We are," said Dick. Then he rubbed his head as if some sudden thought had occurred to him. "What is it, Dick?" asked Warner. "I've realized all at once that I'm tremendously hungry. The Confederates broke up our breakfast. We never had time to think of dinner, and now it's nothing to eat." "Me too," said Pennington. "If you were to hit me in the stomach I'd give back a hollow sound like a drum. Why don't somebody ring the supper bell?" But fires were soon lighted along their whole front, and provisions were brought up from the rear and from the steamers. The soldiers, feeling their strength returning, ate ravenously. They also talked much of the battle. Many of them were yet under the influence of hysterical excitement. They told extraordinary stories of the things they had seen and done, and they believed all they told were true. They ate fiercely, at first almost like wolves, but after a while they resolved into their true state as amiable young human beings and were ashamed of themselves. All the while Buell's army of the Ohio was passing over the river and joining Grant's army of the Tennessee. Regiment after regiment and brigade after brigade crossed. The guns that Nelson had been forced to leave behind were also brought up and were taken over with the other batteries. While the shattered remnants of the Army of the Tennessee were resting, the fresh Army of the Ohio was marching by it in the late hours of the night in order to face the Southern foe in the morning. The Southern army itself lay deep in the woods from which it had driven its enemy. Always the assailant through the day, its losses had been immense. Many thousands had fallen, and no new troops were coming to take their place. Continual reinforcements came to the north throughout the night. Not a soldier came to the south. Beauregard, at dawn, would have to face twice his numbers, at least half of whom were fresh troops. Another conference was held by the Southern generals in the forest, but now the central figure, the great Johnston, was gone. The others, however, summoned their courage anew, and passed the whole night arranging their forces, cheering the men, and preparing for the morn. Their scouts and skirmishers kept watch on the Northern camp, and the Southerners believed that while they had whipped only one army the day before, they could whip two on the morrow. Dick and his friends meanwhile were lying on the earth, resting, but not able to sleep. The nerves, drawn so tightly by the day's work, were not yet relaxed wholly. A deep apathy seized them all. Dick, from a high point on which he lay, saw the dark surface of the Tennessee, and the lights on the puffing steamers as they crossed, bearing the Army of the Ohio. His mind did not work actively now, but he felt that they were saved. The deep river, although it was on their flank, seemed to flow as a barrier against the foe, and it was, in fact, a barrier more and more, as without its command the Second Union Army could never have come to the relief of the First. Dick, after a while, saw Colonel Winchester and other officers near him. They were talking of their losses. They gave the names of many generals and colonels who had been killed. Presently they moved away, and he fell into an uneasy sleep, or rather doze, from which he was awakened after a while by a heavy rumbling sound of a distant cannonade. The boy sprang up, wondering why anyone should wish to renew the battle in the middle of the night, and then he saw that it was no battle. The sound was thunder rolling heavily on the southern horizon, and the night had become very dark. Vivid flashes of lightning cut the sky, and a strong wind rushed among the trees. Heavy drops of water struck him in the face, and then the rain swept down. Dick did not seek protection from the storm, nor did any of those near him. The cool drops were grateful to their faces after the heat and strife of the day. Their pulses became stronger, and the blood flowed in a quickened torrent through their veins. They let it pour upon them, merely seeking to keep their ammunition dry. 10,000 wounded were yet lying untouched in the forest, but the rain was grateful to them too. When they could, they turned their fevered faces up to it that it might beat upon them and bring grateful coolness. Deep in the night, a council like that of the Southern generals was held in the Northern camp, also. Grant, his face an expressionless mask, presided, and said but little. Buell, Sherman, McClernand, Nelson, Wallace, and others were there, and Buell and Sherman, like their chief, spoke little. The three men upon whom most rested were very taciturn that night, but it is likely that extraordinary thoughts were passing in the minds of every one of the three. Grant, after a day in which any one of a dozen chances would have wrecked him, must have concluded that in very deed and truth he was the favorite child of fortune. When one is saved again and again from the very verge, he begins to believe that failure is impossible, and in that very belief lies the greatest guard against failure. It is said of Grant that in the night after his great defeat around the church of Shiloh he was still confident, that he told his generals they would certainly win on the morrow, and he reminded them that if the Union army had suffered terribly, the Southern army must have suffered almost equally so, and would face them at dawn with numbers far less than their own. He had not displayed the greatest skill, but he had shown the greatest moral courage, and now on the night between battles it was that quality that was needed most. Dick, not having slept any the night before, and having passed through a day of fierce battle, was overcome after midnight, and sank into a sleep that was mere lethargy. He awoke once before dawn and remembered, but vaguely, all that had happened. Yet he was conscious that there was much movement in the forest. He heard the tread of many feet, the sound of commands, the neigh of horses, and the rumbling of cannon wheels. The Army of the Ohio was passing to the exposed flank of the Army of the Tennessee, and at dawn it would all be in line. He also caught flitting glimpses of the Tennessee, and of the steamers loaded with troops still crossing, and he heard the boom of the heavy cannon on the gunboats which still, at regular and short intervals, sent huge shells curving into the forest toward the camp of the Southern army. He also saw near him Warner and Pennington sound asleep on the ground, and then he sank back into his own lethargic slumber. He was awakened by the call of a trumpet, and as he rose he saw the whole regiment, or rather what was left of it, rising with him. It was not yet dawn, and a light rain was falling, but smoldering fires disclosed the ground for some distance, and also the river on which the gunboats and transports were now gathered in a fleet. Colonel Winchester beckoned to him. "All right this morning, Dick?" he said. "Yes, sir. I'm ready for my duty." "And you, too, Warner and Pennington?" "We are, sir," they replied together. "Then keep close beside me. I don't know when I may want you for a message. Daybreak will be here in a half hour. The entire Army of the Ohio, led by General Buell in person, will be in position then or very shortly afterward, and a new, and we hope a very different battle will begin." Food and coffee were served to the men, and while the rain was still falling they formed in line and awaited the dawn. The desire to retrieve their fortunes was as strong among the farmer lads as it was among the officers, who took care to spread among them the statement that Buell's army alone was as numerous as the Southern force, and probably more numerous since their enemy must have sustained terrible losses. Thus they stood patiently, while the rain thinned and the sun at last showed a red edge through floating clouds. End of chapter 16, part 1. Chapter 16, Part 2 of The Guns of Shiloh. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 16, The Fierce Finish of Shiloh, Part 2. They waited yet a little while longer, and then the boom of a heavy gun in the forest told them that the enemy was advancing to begin the battle afresh. Again it was the Southern army that attacked, although it was no surprise now. Yet Beauregard and his generals were still sanguine of completing the victory. Their scouts and skirmishers had failed to discover that the entire army of Buell also was now in front of them. Bragg was gathering his division on the left to hurl it like a thunderbolt upon Grant's shattered brigades. Hardee and the Bishop general were in the center, and Breckinridge led the right. But as they moved forward to attack, the Union troops came out to meet them. Nelson had occupied the high ground between Lick and Owl Creeks, and his and the Southern troops met in a fierce clash shortly after dawn. Beauregard, drawn by the firing at that point, and noticing the courage and tenacity with which the Northern troops held their ground, sending in volley after volley, divined at once that these were not the beaten troops of the day before, but new men. This swarthy general, volatile and dramatic, nevertheless had great penetration. He understood on the instant a fact that his soldiers did not comprehend until later. He knew that the whole army of Buell was now before him. For the moment it was Beauregard and Buell who were the protagonists, instead of Grant and Johnston as on the day before. The Southern leader gathered all his forces and hurled them upon Nelson. Weary though the Southern soldiers were, their attack was made with utmost fire and vigor. A long and furious combat ensued. The Southern division under Cheatham rushed to the help of their fellows. Buell's forces were driven in again and again, and only his heavy batteries enabled him to regain his lost ground. Buell led splendid troops that he had trained long and rigidly, and they had not been in the conflict the day before. Fresh and with unbroken ranks, not a man wounded or missing, they had entered the battle, and both Grant and Buell, as well as their division commanders, expected an easy victory where the Army of the Ohio stood. Buell, to his amazement, saw himself reduced to the defensive. He and Grant had reckoned that the decimated brigades of the South could not stand at all before him, but just as on the first day they came on with the fierce rebel yell, hurling themselves upon superior numbers, taking the cannon of their enemy, losing them and retaking them and losing them again, but never yielding. The great conflict increased in violence. Buell, a man of iron courage, saw that his soldiers must fight to the uttermost, not for victory only, but even to ward off defeat. The dawn was now far advanced. The rain had ceased, and the sun again shot down sheaves of fiery rays upon a vast low cloud of fire and smoke in which thousands of men met in desperate combat. 9 o'clock came. It had been expected by Grant that Buell long before that time would have swept everything before him. But for 3 hours Buell had been fighting to keep himself from being swept away. The Southern troops seemed animated by that extraordinary battle fever and absolute contempt of death which distinguished them so often during this war. Buell's army was driven in on both flanks, and only the center held fast. It began to seem possible that the South, despite her reduced ranks, might yet defeat both Northern armies. Another battery dashed up to the relief of the men in blue. It was charged at once by the men in gray so fiercely that the gunners were glad to escape with their guns, and once more the wild rebel yell of triumph swelled through the Southern forest. Dick, standing with his comrades on one of the ridges that they had defended so well, listened to the roar of conflict on the wing, ever increasing in volume, and watched the vast clouds of smoke gathering over the forest. He could see from where he stood the flash of rifle fire and the blaze of cannon, and both eye and ear told him that the battle was not moving back upon the South. "It seems that we do not make headway, sir," he said to Colonel Winchester, who also stood by him, looking and listening. "Not that I can perceive," replied the colonel, "and yet with the rush of 40,000 fresh troops of ours upon the field I deemed victory quick and easy. How the battle grows! How the South fights!" Colonel Winchester walked away presently and joined Sherman, who was eagerly watching the mighty conflict, into which he knew that his own worn and shattered troops must sooner or later be drawn. He walked up and down in front of his lines, saying little but seeing everything. His tall form was seen by all his men. He too must have felt a singular thrill at that moment. He must have known that his star was rising. He, more than any other, with his valor, penetrating mind and decision, had saved the Northern army from complete destruction the first day at Shiloh. He had not been able to avert defeat, but he had prevented utter ruin. His division alone had held together in the face of the Southern attack until night came. Sherman must have recalled, too, how his statement that the North would need 200,000 troops in the West alone had been sneered at, and he had been called mad. But he neither boasted nor predicted, continuing to watch intently the swelling battle. "I had enough fighting yesterday to last me 100 years," said Warner to Dick, "but it seems that I'm to have more today. If the Johnnies had any regard for the rules of war, they'd have retreated long ago." "We'll win yet," said Dick hopefully, "but I don't think we can achieve any big victory. Look, there's General Grant himself." Grant was passing along his whole line. While leaving the main battle to Buell, he retained general command and watched everything. He, too, observed the failure of Buell's army to drive the enemy before them, and he must have felt a sinking of the heart, but he did not show it. Instead, he spoke only of victory, when he made any comment at all, and sent the members of his staff to make new arrangements. He must bring into action every gun and man he had, or he would yet lose. It was now 10 o'clock, and the new battle had lasted with the utmost fury and desperation for 4 hours. Dick, after General Grant rode on, felt as if a sudden thrill had run through the whole army. He saw men rising from the earth and tightening their belts. He saw gunners gathering around their guns and making ready with the ammunition. He knew the remains of Grant's army were about to march upon the enemy, helping the Army of the Ohio to achieve the task that had proved so great. Sherman, McClernand, and other generals now passed among their troops, cheering them, telling them that the time had come to win back what they had lost the day before, and that victory was sure. They called upon them for another great effort, and a shout rolled along the line of willing soldiers. Sherman's whole division now raised itself up and rushed at the enemy, Dick and his comrades in the front of their own regiment. The whole Northern line was now engaged. Grant, true to his resolution, had hurled every man and every gun upon his foe. The Southern generals felt the immense weight of the numbers that were now driving down upon them. Their decimated ranks could not withstand the charge of two armies. In the center, where Buell's men, having stood fast from the first, were now advancing, they were compelled to give way and lost several guns. On the wings, the heavy Northern brigades were advancing also, and the whole Southern line was pushed back. So much inferior was the South in numbers that her enemy began to overlap her on the flanks also. A tremendous shout of exultation swept through the Northern ranks as they felt themselves advancing. The promises of their generals were coming true, and there is nothing sweeter than victory after defeat. Fortune, after frowning upon her so long, was now smiling upon the North. The exultant cheer swept through the ranks again, and back came the defiant rebel yell. A young soldier often feels what is happening with his true instinct as a general. Dick now knew that the North would recover the field, and that the South, cut down fearfully, though having performed prodigies of valor, must fight to save herself. He felt that the resistance in front of them was no longer invincible. He saw in the flash of the firing that the Southern ranks were thin, very thin, and he knew that there was no break in their own advance. Now the sanguine Northern generals planned the entire destruction of the Southern army. There was only one road by which Beauregard could retreat to Corinth. A whole Northern division rushed in to block the way. Sherman, in his advance, came again to the ground around the little Methodist chapel of Shiloh which he had defended so well the day before, and crowded his whole force upon the Southern line at that point. Once more the primitive church in the woods looked down upon one of the most sanguinary conflicts of the whole war. If Sherman could break through the Southern line here, Beauregard's whole army would be lost. But the Southern soldiers were capable of another and a mighty effort. Their generals saw the danger and acted with their usual promptness and decision. They gathered together their shattered brigades and hurled them like a thunderbolt upon the Union left and center. The shock was terrific. Sherman, with all his staunchness and the valor of his men, was compelled to give way. McClernand, too, reeled back, others were driven in also. Whole brigades and regiments were cut to pieces or thrown in confusion. The Southerners cut a wide gap in the Northern army, through which they rushed in triumph, holding the Corinth road against every attack and making their rear secure. Sherman's division, after its momentary repulse, gathered itself anew, and although knowing now that the Southern army could not be entrapped, drove again with all its might upon the positions around the church. They passed over the dead of the day before, and gathered increasing vigor as they saw that the enemy was slowly drawing back. Grant reformed his line, which had been shattered by the last fiery and successful attack of the South. Along the whole line the trumpets sang the charge, and brigades and batteries advanced. But the end of Shiloh was at hand. Despite the prodigies of valor performed by their men, the Southern generals saw that they could not longer hold the field. The junction of Grant and Buell, after all, had proved too much for them. The bugles sounded the retreat, and reluctantly they gave up the ground which they had won with so much courage and daring. They retreated rather as victors than defeated men, presenting a bristling front to the enemy until their regiments were lost in the forest, and beating off every attempt of skirmishers or cavalry to molest them. It was the middle of the afternoon when the last shot was fired, and the Southern army at its leisure resumed its march toward Corinth, protected on the flanks by its cavalry, and carrying with it the assurance that although not victorious over two armies, it had been victorious over one, and had struck the most stunning blow yet known in American history. When the last of the Southern regiments disappeared in the deep woods, Dick and many of those around him sank exhausted upon the ground. Even had they been ordered to follow, they would have been incapable of it. Complete nervous collapse followed such days and nights as those through which they had passed. Nor did Grant and Buell wish to pursue. Their armies had been too terribly shaken to make another attack. Nearly 15,000 of their men had fallen, and the dead and wounded still lay scattered widely through the woods. The South had lost almost as many. Nearly a third of her army had been killed or wounded in the battle, and yet they retired in good order, showing the desperate valor of these sons of hers. The double army which had saved itself, but which had yet been unable to destroy its enemy, slept that night in the recovered camp. The generals discussed in subdued tones their narrow escape, and the soldiers, who now understood very well what had happened, talked of it in the same way. "We knew that it was going to be a big war," said Dick, "but it's going to be far bigger than we thought." "And we won't make that easy parade down to the Gulf," said Warner. "I'm thinking that a lot of lions are in the path." "But we'll win," said Dick. "In the end we'll surely win." Then, after dreaming a little with his eyes open, he fell asleep, gathering new strength for mighty campaigns yet to come. End of chapter 16, part 2. End of The Guns of Shiloh by Joseph A. Altsheler.